Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the scariest thing you have ever seen that you have no explanation for? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was on a cruise with a friend. We shared a cabin. Friend was a really loud snorer. He would usually stay awake until I'd fallen asleep, otherwise I'd find it impossible to sleep with the racket he was making. That night, he'd had a few drinks and passed out drunk, snoring loudly. Didn't bother me, as I had my book to read. It's about 2 a.m. and I'm wide awake. Reading my book in bed, I get this feeling that there's something at the foot of my bed. I glance up, and there is this thing. It looks like a person, but translucent and gray, and the features are blurry. A bit like if a person was made of television static. I feel as if it is being inquisitive, like how a young child would watch you do something. I asked it in my head what it wanted, and as I did, it turned and walked across the room to the door. As it did, it disappeared. I didn't feel scared or threatened by it. No idea what it was. I don't drink or take drugs, so it wasn't that. And I was wide awake. Odd. Really odd. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside of a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, flat section, and then another uphill. The road lights only stretched to the end of the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the road lights, just at the bottom of the last uphill, to gather courage to bike the last section home. It was a partial moon, so it wasn't pitch black, and at the end of the uphill, I saw a figure walking down toward me. I thought I'd wait until he or she got closer, as I would feel less afraid to bike in the dark if there was someone else close. But about halfway down the hill, the person walked into a thin shadow of a tree on the road and never came back out, just disappeared. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I just saw, and then panicked and biked down to the village and stayed there until my parents came driving and wondered why I never came home. They tried to explain it with stuff like the person might have gone into the woods or something. What they didn't disclose, though, out of fear that I'd never dare to bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He had seen her clear as day, walking down the hill for a while. When he looked down for just 1 second and looked up, she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. I later read a book about local legends, and apparently a lot of people during at least a century have seen her walking down the hill and disappearing halfway down. My youngest daughter loved this story, so we've been on ghost stakeouts where we buy pizzas and snacks and hang out at the bottom of the hill, listening to the Ghostbusters theme song and trying to see the ghost. About 25 years ago, my now former wife and I were caretaking a house. We'd been there for several weeks, and we both noticed that we always had that feeling coming up the stairs from the cellar that something was going to grab you as soon as you turned the light switch off. Everything else about the house was normal. We slept with an analog wind-up alarm clock next to the bed, the kind that actually ticks. To set the alarm, you move a tiny third hand to the location of the clock face of your desired time. For example, halfway between 6 and 7 is to awaken at 6:30. It's a physical process, and there's very little way to get it wrong. We always had the clock set to wake us up at 6 a.m. It was not something we fiddled with on a daily basis. One night, the alarm clock went off at like 2 in the morning, old school ringing bells. Both my former wife and I wake up absolutely terrified. I saw a small figure, maybe 2 feet tall, run out of the room. I thought I must have been crazy, until my former wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it as some sort of small goblin. When we looked at the alarm clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's the whole story. Scared the f*** out of me. I have no explanation for it. Nothing else ever happened there, but the cellar feeling persisted. So in college, I studied in the UK. I lived in a house with a group of other American students that had stories of the ghost of a girl who passed away while living there. I never believed in any of it, but it was fun to play along. The kitchen had one way in and out, and right after you entered the kitchen, to your right was a padlocked door to the cellar where she allegedly lived. I had the only key. We were all a little homesick near Thanksgiving, so we decided to do a meal together. This required some creative cooking schedule due to small appliances in the kitchen. So one girl who didn't have a class the next day offered to stay up late to get the turkey going. We went into the cellar, the first and only time that evening, to get larger cooking implements. At 2:04 in the morning, I wake up to my door rattling like someone was pushing against it. I assumed it was a housemate who just went to the wrong door. About 30 seconds later, I hear a scratchy female voice softly saying, "Hello?" every 5 seconds or so. My window was open, and it sounded like it was coming from outside. So I got up to close my window and assumed it was a drunk girl walking back from the pub. I get to the window, and there's no one there. And then I hear, "Hello?" clear as a bell behind me. My door rattles again and goes silent. I've had night terrors before, and hallucinated when I have had a mild fever, and I assume I'm still asleep and lay back down. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who's cooking tells me I had the creepiest night. At 1:50, I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. Then the door rattled. Then at 2:10, the door rattled again, and I heard footsteps coming down. She told me this before I had said anything to anyone about what I'd experienced. My mom and I were driving up from Texas to Washington in late October. We stopped to rest in this national park in southern Colorado and were pretty much the only people there. It was usually daylight when we stopped to rest because my mom preferred driving at night. We were sitting there making something to eat when this guy on a bicycle went past us and just glared at us with these hate-filled eyes. My mom and I were pretty creeped out by him, but went on about our business and then laid down in the car to sleep, her up front and my boxer and I in the back seat. I got this feeling like I was being watched, and then my dog's hackles went up and she started this really deep down kind of growl. She only ever made that growl when she was really bothered by something. I reached over and chambered a round in my shotgun, and my mom heard me and said, "Hey, are you awake? Do you want to get out of here?" And I said, "Hell yeah, I do." We got up, and I stood guard with my shotgun and the dog when she packed everything into the car and we left. We couldn't see him, but we could both feel him watch us, and the dog didn't settle down again until we'd left that place far behind. We made a beeline for Moab and stopped at this truck stop to rest instead. When we got up, we went in and got something to eat and met this really friendly trucker and told him what happened. He shadowed us north for quite a ways and then handed us off to other truckers. They shadowed us all the way to Idaho. They were all a great bunch of guys for sure. Working in a nursing home for years during the night, and everyone always complained of weird stuff like noises on the top floor. I never believed in any of that, so I was always the one going upstairs to do night checks. One night I was changing a resident on that floor with a colleague, and my colleague complained he heard something like people walking. We were in the resident room, and I had to go to the cupboard at the end of the corridor to get bed sheets, and when I was coming back with the bed sheets, I kept hearing steps and like if someone was touching and opening plastic bags. I was so annoyed and looked outside the room and saw a shadow passing the corridor. The issue is that the shadow was so big, like if literally a person just passed by, along with a step noise and plastic bags. I freaked out so badly and froze completely. I had to call another colleague to come upstairs because I was so scared of coming out of the resident room. Bear in mind that I do not believe in those things. And for 2 years, I was always the one doing night checks on the top floor and bottom floor on my own. Never had any problem and never saw anything. Since that day, I never went upstairs alone and was always very scared. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory. He used to work on the London Underground doing maintenance on the tracks, tunnels, etc. Once he went into a tunnel with 2 other colleagues. they'd stopped to do something, and this man said to my uncle, like, "Hey," uncle's name, "can you show me the way out?" My uncle, thinking it was one of his guys, said, "You know the way out." I think he was so engrossed in his work that he didn't turn around to see this bloke to start with. So the guy says, "I'm so cold." And then my uncle said he immediately felt dead cold, and the air around him dropped. Not sure what he meant by that. So my uncle turns round and shines a light on him. My uncle said to me, "This bloke is what he would call a ghost standing there." He was holding a really old vintage lamp and wearing a really old dirty uniform. He said the feeling he got was so strange, as if he knew this bloke was a ghost. The bloke just kept saying over and over again, "I'm so cold, I'm so cold." My uncle eventually said to this guy, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" And he looked dead at my uncle and said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." I'm unsure if the colleagues came to see who my uncle was talking to, but one of them tried to approach this bloke thinking it was someone in their team playing a joke, and this bloke just disappeared right in front of their eyes. All of them freaked out and ran. They refused to go back into the tunnel. My uncle and 2 colleagues refused to go down that tunnel again. Some other colleagues have said they've seen this bloke, and he always says how cold he is. My uncle is retired now, but says he thinks of this bloke from time to time. I know there's always going to be regional or national dialect or idioms or phrases that other countries or towns or states don't use, but I'm pretty sure I've never said the word bloke as many times in a couple of paragraphs in my life, to the point as I was reading it, I was forgetting even what the word bloke was. So, I don't know. It has nothing to do with anything except an observation. Hey, have a good day. When I was about 7 or 8, I had a rope swing in my backyard. I was obsessed with it and would play on it for hours. One day, just like any other, I was swinging on it, and out of the corner of my eye, I spotted an animal. At first, I thought it was a squirrel, but as I turned to look at it, it was much bigger and darker than a squirrel, so I figured it was a stray cat. But as I watched it walk across the yard, it wasn't a cat. It was something I'd never seen before. It was all black, had the head of a badger and the body of a squirrel. It was about 2 feet in length and the height of a small dog. I got a little spooked because I figured it was a rabid animal, so I got off the swing and backed away. That's when, in all seriousness, I watched this mystery animal run toward the fence and run right through it, leaving a hole or damage to the fence. It just phased right through. I sat in awe for a good 3 minutes before I slowly walked inside. I was about 12 at the time. Every year my parents and I would drive from Montreal to Nova Scotia to visit family. Having always gone the Trans-Canada route, we decided to go through the States for a change. So we ended up going southeast through Maine and eventually on the NB, then NS. I remember we were in a very, very remote area, like we hadn't seen a house for a long time. This was before GPS and Google Maps, so there was a growing concern in the vehicle that we might run out of gas. I don't remember the name of the road, but it was a country road that had a mountain on the right side and went straight up through dense bush. And on the left it was dense bush and a steep downhill where I could make out a river at the bottom of the cliff, about 75 to 100 feet down the hill. Trees hung over the road, so despite it being a sunny day, the road was shady, with the exception of places where the sun would break through. I heard my dad up front ask Mom, "What the is that up ahead?" As I leaned over to look, and down the road, we could all see what looked like a man off in the distance on the side of the road. Too far to see color or anything, just a big dark shape standing there. As we rolled on down the road, this dude, or whatever it was, crossed the road, both lanes, I shit you not, 3 to 4 steps. Once, on the other side of the road, he just vanished into the woods. As we got to the spot where he had crossed, Dad slowed right down to look around. Nothing. Not a sight of anyone. No trail. Nothing. No one knows what they saw, but 30 years later, it gets brought up every couple of years, and the feelings are mutual, and weird and creepy. I was looking out my bedroom window late one summer night at stars. I noticed an oddly colored flashing star that was 100% moving. If you've ever seen a ping pong ball held up, suspended by airflow, that was the type of movement. I'd say bubbling is a good description. This had me weirded out, so I pulled out my phone and started recording it. Maybe 10 seconds later, the most terrifying thing I've ever seen happens. An effing beam of white light, cylindrical and bright. Not as much as a helicopter spot surge, but a high-powered flashlight appears in my neighbor's backyard, like a literal beam from heaven, maybe 8 feet in diameter, and from the blackness of space, as far up as I could see. No source or anything visible. This light is first pointing in the center of their backyard, which is maybe 45 feet from my face. My window is on the side of the house at the rear. Then it starts frantically moving around, as if it were searching for something. I felt this in my whole body immediately. I was like, it's looking for me. Stomach on the floor. Then it moves up to the side yard toward the front of the house, still in the neighbor's property, but now only 20 feet from where I'm standing. It then diverted onto the side of their house and scanned up the wall to a window directly across from me, 15 to 20 feet. I slammed my window down closed, shut the blackout curtains, and quickly left my room and went to a bathroom in the center of the house with no window visible. This was so effing terrifying and world-changing that I can't express it with words. It 100% happened, and I felt it in my bones and everything. I had this feeling that it was a warning or something, like don't film or bring attention to me or us. It had to know that it wasn't my window and was trying to frighten me. If it detected me filming with a phone from a star that's not our sun positioned in the sky, far as hell, it 100% knew exactly where I was. The neighbor's window wouldn't have even had a vantage point of it due to how it was positioned. I was viewing it 45 degrees over their 2-story house, so the neighbor in that window, directly facing my window, couldn't physically see it or where it was. That and the guy feeling I mentioned are why I feel it was warning or intentionally scaring the life out of me. It was on a "we're searching for you" show right in front of me intentionally to dissuade me from giving it focused attention or filming. It worked too, if that's the actual case. I still haven't scanned the night sky since then, and that was 2 to 3 years ago, and I used to really like to look up at night for stuff a lot. Aside from altering my worldview or perspective completely, I knew now that something unimaginable to me existed, and it watched me watching it. It made me not afraid of night and the stuff up high, but motivated to not be doing it anymore. A surreal and insane experience. Thinking about it makes me get chills and tear up. Not sadness, but a feeling of overwhelmingness and having a life-altering revelation. I've never told this publicly. I was feeling afraid for a long time, almost 3 years, and only my wife, parents, and a single friend heard this. Seeing this video made me think of it immediately, like I was seeing something being targeted by something impossible or unknown, just like I felt. The event from the first appears to be covering the neon or windows, and me slamming the window or curtains was maybe 7 to 9 seconds, no more than 10 and longer than 5. It's impossible to know exactly, but I'm pretty certain my range is right on it. The only other thing it could have been, still equally if not more terrifying, was an altered image of reality being uploaded to my mind. As in, I and only I would have seen this, and if anyone happened to have a view of the area it happened, nothing odd would have been seen by them. I don't know. Crazy shit though. I can't believe I'm actually posting it finally. In 2002, I came home from college to the Cincinnati area and met up with a couple of high school friends. We were driving around in northern Kentucky around 9 p.m. It was unusually foggy that night, low-hanging clouds, and the top of the hills were completely hidden in the fog. I was riding in the back seat, and my 2 friends were in the front. Just after we crossed the bridge, I saw a light up in the fog, and I assumed it was a helicopter. But that immediately made no sense since it was so foggy. couldn't be a helicopter. There would be no visibility. I pointed it out to them and they saw it, but because they were in the front seat, they weren't able to look out the back window, which is how I had the best view of it. I kept reporting what I saw. They eventually pulled over and we watched for a minute, but then the light had disappeared. After waiting a couple of minutes, we decided to keep moving. A few minutes later, it came back. The light was visible, and as I was watching, it was getting brighter and appeared to be getting closer to the hilltop, to the edge of the fog. And that's when it happened. I saw the edge of this round, dark thing pop out of the fog and hover there a little, almost like Jack Torrance's face sticking through the door of The Shining. I didn't see where the lights were being emitted from. They were still back far enough that they were in a cloud cover, but whatever I was looking at was a dark, round surface. Obviously, my mind went straight to UFO. It's still inexplicable. I have no logical explanation for what it was or what it could be. A blimp is the best thing I could compare it to, except this thing disappeared back into the clouds when the light went off. It wasn't until the last couple of years, when the movie Nope came out, that I kinda had a wee panic attack at the movies. The imagery used in that movie is very similar to what I saw that night. Almost 20 years ago, as a nursing student, I was working a night shift on a very poorly staffed ward. It was sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., and I was making my rounds, checking blood pressure, pulse, and other observations. The hospital was in a fairly rural area, and through a window at the back of the ward, fields were stretching out in the distance. Some movement in the darkness caught my eye. Must be 150 meters away. I noticed what looked like a blurry figure, half ambling, half floating across the grass. It held some long walking stick, like a scythe, without the blade. With each exaggerated movement, the figure seemed to shimmer, confusing me, fading. Within milliseconds, I froze in place. The hair on my arms stood up. My heart pounded with that feeling when fear makes your blood run cold. Petrified, I called out for the only other colleague on shift. She arrived quite quickly. I just pointed. "What is that?" She pushed her glasses up to the bridge of her nose. "I think it's a man," she replied. "It looks like a ghost." She squinted, looked again, and said, "No, it just looks like a man. I'd better call security." As I stood there, still in shock, the ghostly image gradually sharpened. The white, billowy form-like robes turned into a patient gown, and the scythe was actually an IV pole with a bag attached. He was ambling across the grass, making exaggerated movements because the IV pole wheels don't work well on grass and kept getting stuck in the mud. My colleague returned, confirming that security had gotten a report of a patient who had absconded from a ward and was grateful we'd been able to locate him. To this day, I can't explain how patients manage to slip away from wards in the middle of the night. Anyway, this is the story of how I discovered I was short-sighted. I booked an eye test the next week. I grew up in a haunted house in Canada from the age of 7 to 18, so I've seen and experienced a lot of incidents that I cannot and will not attempt to explain. I feel like this background will give a little context to what happened last week. The house in Canada was obviously haunted. Doors slamming, orbs, shadows, electronic phenomenon, you name it. This house had it. Whatever resided there was never malicious to any of us, maybe even playful when we were kids, but I can say that other than being a little confused, I was not afraid of it. Last week, my wife and I flew to New York, UK, lovely town, which is made even more special by the people who live, curate, and care for this absolute gem of a town. We spent 3 days wandering around, shopping and drinking pints with the locals. Part of the shopping involved going into a 4-story antique store by the minister. The first floor was really cool, lots of housewares from a bygone era. The second floor was records, and the third was curiosities gathered from a life of travel. The fourth floor was f***ed up. As my wife and I rounded the banister, it felt like I walked into the saddest, angriest place I'd ever been. On one wall were World War I medals, on the other were World War II medals, and in the middle was a rocking horse. I do not know what, who, or why. All I knew was I had to run for my life. The darkness that saturated every inch of that room was indescribably terrifying. I abandoned my beautiful wife in a room with the darkest presence I've ever experienced. I sprinted from the building and sat on the front steps, waiting for my wife to come down and ask, "What the is wrong with you?" She eventually meandered down and said, "Yeah, you felt that too, huh? The rocking horse started rocking when you ran." And this, folks, is why I will not be going back there. When I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11, my family was visiting my grandparents in the mountains of Colorado. I woke up in the middle of the night, my bedroom door slowly opening and subsequently a cold wind blowing at me. A wolf figure slowly came around the corner, but it had a kind of purple glow to it. Once I made eye contact, I couldn't break it. In my mind, I felt that it was asking me to follow. So I got out of bed and slowly walked toward the door. The wolf turned around and started walking down the hallway. When I got to the door, it was gone. I suddenly felt extremely scared and ran back to bed and hid under the covers. Fast forward about 8 years, I was back visiting my grandparents with my cousin. We were working at a local hotel, breaking ice off of the sidewalks for 8 hours a day. One night we decided to take a walk, and about a quarter mile from the house, a wolf was standing in the middle of the road. We were 30 yards away when we saw it and froze. Mind you, wolves hadn't been in Colorado for decades at this time. It was alone. We slowly started walking back to the house, and it started to walk as well, keeping its distance and its pace. We sped up, it sped up. We started running, it started at a gallop. We got back to the house, ran inside, and slammed the door behind us. We went upstairs to look out the window, and the wolf was just sitting at the end of the driveway, staring at our window. I'm going to start by saying that I'm on the fence about paranormal stuff. I'd like to think there's something there, but I will also go through every single logical explanation I can first, and do my best to put stuff down to normal incidents, you know? Anyway, my old family home was a little off. It generally had a heavy air about it, and no matter how homely we tried to make it feel, you always felt at least a little unwelcome. We lived there 12 years, and it never felt like home. It was a pretty old house. 2 100-plus-year-old terraced houses knocked together in West Yorkshire, UK. Creepy arse coal cellar included, although for some crazy reason we only had access to one half. The other half was walled off with a single brick knocked out for ventilation. On a night, I'd be laid up all night listening to the sound of a person walking up and down the landing. Wasn't my parents, as I knew their footsteps, and wasn't my younger sister, as the footsteps were too heavy. They'd move along the landing from the top of the stairs, stop outside my room, and then walk back to the landing. It used to creep me the f*** out, as I could never see a shadow of anyone standing outside my door either. You'd hear voices and bangs in the other rooms of the house when no one else was in, not the neighbors moving around or sounds of the house settling either. The scariest thing that ever happened was one night not long after we got our first family dog. I was sitting in the living room with my dad watching TV. Now, the 2 houses knocked together part is important here because of this. One half of the lower floor was the living room, and the other half was the kitchen/dining area. There were entrance doors for both halves by the front and back doors, so you could walk a full circle around the downstairs, going past both external doors. We were just chilling out. The dog was vibing, sprawled by the radiator under the front window. All of a sudden, we hear an almighty bang, the sound of the back door slamming shut and rattling. Because of the location of the door, we even felt the vibration. A couple of seconds later, our dog goes ballistic, barking at the hallway. I go to see what's going on, and the front door is wide open. There's nobody out on the street that could have opened the door, and nowhere someone could have run to hide without us seeing or hearing them. Go to check the back door, and it's all locked up with the chain on and everything. Creeped me out for a good while, and I refused to be home alone for a couple of weeks after. At a stoplight, waiting to make a left turn, there are two turning lanes. I'm in the inner lane and another car is in the outer lane. Light turns green, and as I'm turning, the car in the outer lane speeds up and makes a U-turn but loses control and is about to hit me. Bracing for impact, I honked at the car and slammed the brakes in hopes of minimalizing the condition. I feel a cold splash from the iced tea I had in the cup holder and looked down. When I looked up, the light was still red, and my car and the other car were still waiting behind the traffic white line. When it turns green, I don't press the gas pedal, and sure enough, the car in the outer lane speeds up and almost hits the inner cement island, trying to correct the U-turn. As I wait, I look down and my tea is spilled all over. I don't know what or how it happened, but it freaked me out for days. I have no explanation for what happened. Needless to say, I now drive further to avoid that left turn. Most of the really scary things in my life have gotten explanations eventually. The one that remains very scary, even after learning what was going on was a hike I took. My husband and I took our baby to his parents to meet them. It was calving season, so they couldn't leave the ranch, and we didn't want them to miss out on the newborn phase for our baby. Once there, my husband gets to work helping on the ranch. I was still recovering from a difficult labor, third-degree tears, etc., so I was absolutely not allowed to help pull calves or haul hay bales. So I decided to use our baby carrier and take some slow walks through the canyons around the ranch. It's a beautiful area. For the first time out there, I saw butterflies. Not just one or two, but a whole little cloud of them. I followed them to a little dry canyon, where I could see a stream a little ways beyond. There were 4 or 5 different types of butterflies, and just dozens and dozens of each type. When the wind shifted, I smelled intestines. Looking around, I realized there were a lot of dead things nearby in various states of skeletal remains. At least 1 cow, an elk, and a mule deer. A few bones that looked like coyotes. Lots that were just old and scattered. But there was one that looked like it was recent, really recent, just lying under an overhang. That was the one I had smelled when the breeze shifted. I had passed it on my way into the canyon without seeing the butterflies underneath and had to pass it again to leave. Later, my father-in-law would explain that butterflies in the desert will drink sweat and tears from mammals to survive, and if there is blood around, they will drink that for the salt. Also, cougars or mountain lions like to find canyons or dry washes that lead to streams, as those tend to funnel wildlife through narrowed paths. The mountain lion perches above on a rock or tree branch and waits to drop down on the animals passing beneath. They will hunt along wildlife corridors and overpasses for the same reasons. This method allows the mountain lion to take down animals larger than itself, like elk or cattle. There wasn't hardly any meat missing from the deer, maybe a pound or 2. I'd interrupted the lion's meal when I walked into its funnel. That particular cat was well known to the ranch. He was about 15 years old at that point and had been hunting closer and closer to the barns that year, to the point he'd been seen in between the house and the barn, and some of the barn cats had gone missing. Cougars get desperate for easier prey as they age, and it's uncommon for them to live as long as that one did. He finally passed at around 16 or 17 years old.